Welcome to Scriptural Works, a podcast that engages Scripture in new and innovative ways to produce meaning for today's postmodern world. Co-host Greg Camp, Professor Emeritus, Pastor and Biblical Scholar, and Patrick Spencer, Biblical Scholar and Silicon Valley Tech Executive, employ various interpretive approaches to generate new meaning from ancient text, revealing timeless wisdom relevant for ministers, lay leaders, and interested readers of the Bible. Get more podcast articles and other useful resources at scripturalworks.com. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Scriptural Works. I'm Patrick Spencer and I'm joined by my co-host Greg Camp. Greg, good to see you as always.
Good morning, Patrick.
Well, we have a guest that our audience hopefully is familiar with. If you aren't, you got to go watch. I forgot which episode it is. It's episode 6 or 7, somewhere in there. Stan Helton, Dr. Stan Helton. He is up from north of the border. He rejoins us. We're going to be talking about a different subject this time. The previous podcast was on the ending of the Gospel of Mark, and specifically some of his research on the church fathers and origin in particular. It was a fascinating conversation. Check it out. We covered all, or I think most of, or all the different endings of the gospel that exist, specifically the one that ends in 16:8, and then the one that ends, the longer ending that has another 15 or so verses that runs through verse 20. It was a great conversation. Check it out. Stan, great to see you.
Oh, always good to be with you guys.
All right. Well, for those who are not familiar with Stan, let me do a quick intro on him. He has a BA in Biblical Studies from Oklahoma Christian University, a master's as well as a Master of Divinity in Historical Theology and Greek New Testament and Ministry from Abilene Christian University. He wasn't done. He did a D-Min after that in Ministry and Leadership, also at Abilene Christian University. And then he decided he needed 2 more degrees, so he did a master's in theology and a PhD in New Testament at New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary. He currently is the president and professor of New Testament and Ministry at Alberta Bible College. He's been there since 2015. He's a governing authority for the Church of Christ, the Christian church in Alberta, responsible for clergy registration for weddings. He was, I think he stepped away, he may come back, the commissioner and evaluator since 2017 for the Association of Biblical Higher Education's Commission on Accreditation. He does a bunch of other things on top of that. I follow him on Facebook, and it seems like he's in a different location every other week. So, Stan, good to talk to you again.
Well, it's good to be here. Good to be here. Thanks a lot for that nice introduction.
Well, and this is a continuation. Hopefully, our audience has been watching a few of our podcasts. We embarked on a trek to cover different episodes in Luke Acts that feature marginalized characters that appear and then disappear just about as quickly in the narrative. And we covered one with Scott Spencer that was a fascinating discussion on the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts 8. We did one with Cliff Barbaric over at ACU on the Good Samaritan. I think that's one of the last shows that we did. And then Greg and I followed up and did a piece on Acts 12 and the characterization of Peter and the house church and Rhoda in Acts 12. And that was a great conversation. You can check those out on our website as well as on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and so forth. So Stan wrote a paper and has done some research on Acts 5, and to do episodes that are interesting in Luke Acts, you can't miss this one, the story of Ananias and Sapphira. So before we dive into the discussion, let's do a quick blurb from our sponsor. Are you ready to take your calling deeper? Abilene Christian University's Graduate School of Theology offers master's, doctoral, and certificate programs designed to equip ministers, scholars, and leaders for transformative service. Whether you're pursuing a Master of Divinity, a Doctor of Ministry, or a graduate certificate in practical ministry, Abilene Christian University's flexible online and on-campus options help you grow in faith and impact. Learn more at acu.edu/GST. That's acu.edu/GST. So let's dive into this interesting text, 11 verses. Greg, maybe tee us up. What's going on in this passage? What's it all about? And then we can turn it over to Stan and talk about intertextuality among many other things.
Right. Well, as you mentioned, Patrick, this story is certainly odd and controversial, and the violence is, well, it's fatal. So here we have a passage in which we have a couple, Ananias and Sapphira, who sell some property, and they, along with others, are voluntarily sharing their resources. It's not mandatory, as the text tells us, but they decide to keep back part of the money, but pretend that they're giving everything, a much larger amount. Peter somehow knows they're lying, confronts them each separately, Ananias first, and then 3 hours later, his wife Sapphira. And as soon as he confronts them, they each immediately die. So the husband's dead. The wife comes in not knowing her husband's dead, lies as well, and boom, down she goes. And obviously, great fear comes upon the whole church. It is shocking, which is probably what led me to write a paper for one of our grad classes at some point on it. Wonderful little thing. So, Stan, what got you interested in this episode? And then when you teach it to others, what's their reaction?
Okay. Of course, I'm deeply involved in study of the book of Acts. And so I've known of this story since childhood and have always found it a little bit odd, as you've suggested, that it doesn't seem to fit the larger narrative or even the tone of where we're going in terms of Luke and Acts, particularly around the theme of Israel's redemption. Forgiveness is being offered on every side. Even Simon the sorcerer comes off a bit easier uh, trying to buy the Holy Spirit than this couple does. And so it really stands out. The way I've got into this particular topic is that I'm friends with Ashley Hibbert, Dr. Ashley Hibbert, with the Center for the Study of Bible and Violence. And they were putting together their inaugural edition. And I suggested along the way that I'd done some work on Ananias and Sapphira and would love to do some more if they were interested in a piece like that. And so I'm honored that they accepted my piece for their very first edition of that journal. And so that's how I kind of moved into writing the piece and going deeper into it. Students always are caught off guard by it, particularly, one of the interesting things about my students today is that sometimes we have students who are really kind of reading it. It's not as if they hadn't heard it before, but they're reading it for the first time. And so they find it, they're usually taken aback just a bit by it.
What do they find so shocking?
Well, I think it's the punishment. Yeah.
It is pretty drastic.
Also trying to figure out exactly what happens because apparently there's a pledge that's made, but Luke doesn't spell out the pledge. He allows you to pick it up in just the reading of the story that some commitment previous has been made. And so just following the stories.
Yeah. So, now, just prior to this account, we have somebody else who makes a generous gift, what would appear to be a real, actual generous gift, and that's Barnabas in Acts 4, 36 and 37. So that precedes this. And it says that he comes and lays this at the apostles' feet.
Yeah.
And then Ananias and Sapphira do the same thing. So tell us about what that at the apostles' feet might mean when it's both in the Barnabas account and the Ananias and Sapphira account about authentic and counterfeit generosity.
Well, I think at one level, bringing it to the apostles' feet was a way of symbolically giving it to God. While the apostles, I also think the apostles are administrating it. And as I've noted before, by the time we get to chapter 6, we find out that there are some Greek-speaking widows among them that are being neglected. And so apparently the distribution of these resources didn't always go as planned or as understood. And so I think in terms of these stories together, there's a summary statement that kind of echoes Acts chapter 2, 42 and following in Acts 4, that there's this sense of not socialism, but a sense that when somebody's in need, they would do whatever was necessary in order to meet that need. And then Barnabas is a positive example. I think there's a couple of things going on there. I think, first of all, Barnabas is a Levite, and Luke's interested in showing us that even priests and Levites were becoming believers. But But I do think that you got a good sample of Luke's double stories. In fact, you get two stories doing sort of the same thing. But Barnabas is genuine, and Ananias and Sapphira is not. And so it all fits together in a larger theme of the kind of community that's formed after Pentecost. Because of the presence of the Spirit in God's redeeming work, what kind of community are we? And simply put, we're the kind of community that takes care of the least of ours.
Right.
Stan,
I don't know if I
building
got all
on
the pieces you were thinking of, Greg, but
Yeah, that's great. I also note that this is where Barnabas is introduced to the
that's right.
narrative as a whole, and the oddity that he's a Levite who owns property.
Yeah.
that's
Yeah,
a
I don't
great.
know if it's significant that the property seems to be in Cyprus, but I don't know
Right.
what to make of that other than we're now moving beyond Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria.
Exactly.
We're moving out. Yeah.
Yeah.
Patrick, what was it
No,
you were?
no. I think that's a great point. I was just speculating when you start thinking about patron-client
Yeah.
relationships and patronage and benefaction. There's something going on here because you have, the wealthy, those who have power, who are helping others, and typically you want something back in exchange. And you have, Barnabas demonstrates the real benefaction that you see it exemplified in
Yeah.
Jesus's ministry and his teachings back in Luke. But with Ananias and Sapphira, you see that they aren't fully enacting that. And is that maybe going on in this text as well from a comparative standpoint?
I think so. And if we can bring a little bit of John Barclay and Paul in here, I the larger view is not so much patron client, but reciprocity. What do the rich get in turn for being part of this? Is they're part of this great community? They get to participate in this larger, wholesome community where all people are cared for.
Yeah.
So it's not as if the rich don't get anything, but we do certainly appreciate it when folks give to our ministries, don't we?
Yeah. Well, we have Joshua Jip coming up in a podcast here pretty
Oh,
soon.
okay.
And that's going to be part of the discussion because of all the work he's done around hospitality. So we'll
Oh,
have to
yes. That
pull
would
that
very much
question and
be.
pose it to him. How's that? Right.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Not my
So
lane.
Stan, So, Stan, you read this text, and the very, verse 11, the last part of the episode, actually, introduces the term church or ecclesia for the
Yeah.
first time in the book of Acts, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
It appears at the very end of the judgment scene, obviously. Why does Luke choose this place, right? It occurs again in chapter 11, but you'd think almost, you mentioned Pentecost. We're going to start talking about the church and the gathering and so forth. Pentecost back in Acts 2 would have been maybe the ideal place in the Luke Acts narrative to bring up the word ecclesia for the first time. What's your thoughts there?
Yeah. I'm not sure I can give you a causal answer in the sense of why is it here.
You can't get into
But
Luke's mind.
well, I try really hard to, and as all of us as interpreters, we try hard to get behind our text and hear what our at least our implied author is trying to say. But I would say that it does fit here in the sense that the Ananias and Sapphira story fits particularly intertextually with its connection to the Achan story to the time of conquest. And conquest occurs by the people or the children of Israel in the wilderness or the assembly in the wilderness. And the Septuagint was fairly consistent in translating that word ecclesia. And so I'm convinced that when you've got a Jewish Christian of the first century reading the Septuagint and thinking about the church that they belong to, that's their immediate reference. It's not the Roman assembly or the general word for assembly. They're hearing this echo that goes all the way back to Moses in the wilderness and conquest. Yeah,
That's fascinating.
and
There's
so I
certainly,
think
I
I think
think,
I think there may be a connection there.
yeah. Well, there's a lot more intertextual connections that exist in, the New Testament in general, but specifically if you're looking at Acts, then it's just not those are spelled out when they quote specifically from a book of the Old Testament or intertestamental literature. There's
Yeah,
allusions and there's echoes, as you know, and this
yeah,
probably is one of them. To your point,
that's right. And I'm usually unwilling to vouch for an echo unless I've got enough data to say, okay, yes, it's really that. Otherwise, we're just saying it could be this. And I think it could be. I think we're on the right track with ecklησία.
Right. And
Yeah.
for those on who watch us on YouTube, we'll put up a slide that shows some of those echoes between that Achan story that you mentioned and this account. Those who are listening to us, you probably want to go over and flip on the YouTube channel just to catch some of those charts and see what some of those connections will be.
There's a value add to watching YouTube in this case.
That's right.
Yeah, no doubt it helps.
Our...
It definitely helps to have the list. I looked over them today, and so I think my contribution is that I drilled a little deeper and I found some things. Even the conversations that take place in each of the texts, while not exactly the same words, they seem to be rhetorically doing the same kind of things. In terms of Peter's response, or Peter's words and Joshua's words, Achan's response, Ananias and Sapphira. And so I suggested some places in the paper where it sounds like we're telling sort of the same story. Again, this is the place where I wouldn't swear on echoes, because you don't get clear echoes, but you get this kind of back and forth dialogue that makes you think that you're listening to both stories at the same time. So,
well, you talked about that in the Acts 12 episode and the imprisonment of Peter.
yeah.
Those echoes, particularly with the Exodus, are all over the place.
Oh, yeah.
New Testament. But in Acts 12, you have that with Peter and his imprisonment. One who's familiar with the Exodus story is going to hear those echoes and Peter's imprisonment. And in this case here, I think you're right about the use of ecklησία. It's a compelling argument for sure.
Yeah.
Hey, Greg, I think you were fearful that we might miss this topic.
Yes, I was going to say before we unpack all those echoes, let's pick up a question right at the end of our interaction of Ananias and Sapphira, and that's the reaction by the church as a whole. It says that great fear came upon the whole church. But in spite of this fear, you have many more believers that are added to the Lord, both men and women. How does fear attract rather than repel in this case, when I think in our modern churches, we think, excuse me, in terms of fear driving people away? What's happening there?
Well, I think we modern people assume that fear should never be part of our encounter with God or in the midst of God's people. And I would disagree with that assessment. I would also remind us that the word phobos, or the word translated fear, has a broader range of meaning. When we think of fear, we don't usually think of respect, but the original word has that range of meaning. And so while I don't want to minimize what we would legitimately call fear, I also think that we modern people, we compartmentalize so much that can two things be happening at the same time? Can my fear also be awe and wonder? And I think some of that, one story from my own ministry is that we served in an inner city community one time, in which we had one of our members kill four fringe members of the congregation. And by fringe, I mean they just didn't attend a lot, but they were connected to us. And I'd spent several years helping this historically suburban church take more seriously and more honestly their urban environment. It had changed over the years. And as a young minister, I remember thinking that my work had come to nothing, that I brought people to this point and this happened. But what happened after that is we continued to grow, and our influence in the community actually became more vibrant, because people looked at us willing to deal with the darkness that were a regular part of their life. And so I've had the experience of having fear and wonder and wondering what God is up to, all in a bunch, right? Yeah. Greg, I don't know if that answers your question, but
no, it does, because it leads to my next one, and that is that this narrative moves from an internal threat that ends up with the community fearing to an external threat where the Sanhedrin is persecuting the apostles, which should lead to fear, although it's not mentioned that that's what's happening.
Yes.
Is this sequence theologically significant in the sense that people need to experience this internal to the group so they can face effectively this external opposition? Do they need to be kind of purified in some fashion?
I don't know. Again, let me answer it kind of individually. And I'm a year and a half past chemo treatment. And so went through a time of deep fear and darkness in order to get to where we are today. And I find that, having looked death that closely in the eyes, I'm not so scared. I'm a bit bolder now, because what are they going to do? What cancer couldn't do to me, So, so I do think that their boldness increases that. In fact, one of the traits of the presence of the Spirit from the beginning of the book of Acts is people speaking with boldness.
Yeah.
So boldness is one of the signs that, in fact, that the Holy Spirit is empowering a person or a community. So
when Peter even says when he's brought in and arrested, we must obey God rather than men. He's rather bold at that moment.
Yeah, he basically says we're drawing the line here. Now, I think it's interesting where he draws the line. He's willing to probably work with the Sanhedrin at various levels, but when they said you can't preach or teach in this name anymore, he basically said, no, you don't get to draw that one.
Yeah. So that's fascinating, and we already alluded to the fact your work around Joshua 7 and the story of Achan. When did you get this idea that there's an intertextual connection? And let's define intertextual, Stan. It can be
Sure.
specific citation, right? Those are easy.
Yeah.
You know how they change the actual text in the quotation, right? Then you have echoes and you have allusions. How do you define those? And in this case, I don't think we have a citation per se, right? But we have more of an echo or an allusion back to that Achan text.
And we've also got the one shared single word for the offense that Achan does, and that Ananias and Sapphira does, the conspiring term. I would say that that you feel the stories. If you know both stories, then you can kind of pick up on them as you're reading it. But intertextuality is really the use of a previous text to either amplify the meaning of the previous text or to grab the meaning of the context. Sometimes it's worth, by the way, with that one word, and the only place it occurs in the Septuagint outside of the Apocrypha is in this text. And so it causes you to think, is there more to these texts? And so as I teach my students, when you find a text alluded to, it's usually worth going back and reading the context of it. But intertextuality at its simplest form is simply taking a text and reusing it, often to new purposes. And one doesn't require an exact citation for that to happen. It's just that getting an exact quote from a previous text is helpful for locating it. But in this case, we don't get that. But as I argue in my paper, you get these very similar moves in each of the texts, and you're going, boy, these texts sound a lot like each other. And I would argue that in some sense, we should have mentioned this maybe a little earlier, but if Luke is picking up on Exodus and Isaiah, I'm wondering if Acts, in some sense, is picking up on the conquest.
Mm-hmm.
As you go from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria, it sounds a bit like the battle plans of Joshua to take the land. And in some ways, they are taking the land. I just haven't played with it enough across all of Acts to say, does it show up enough to say, yeah, in fact, he's really reflecting on Joshua.
Interesting.
On the book of Joshua.
Unlike the readers or hearers, listeners of Acts, our audience may need a little tutorial on the Achan episode. Tell us what's going on in that episode to get us up to speed, Stan, so we can understand the connection. I think Greg has a follow-on question after that, probably.
Well, it's at the beginning of the conquest story, and God makes very clear in the text that the city is uh, booty is not to be taken from the city. The city is going to be a demonstration of in Hebrew karam, in Greek anathema. It's going to be under the band, which is just a really interesting concept. And what we have is we have one individual who takes for himself several items, which he takes to the middle of his tent and he buries in the ground.
Yep.
And so, but instead of coming forward, Joshua is informed by God that somebody has done something, and by lot, they finally come down to Achan. Achan could have any time along the way said, "Hey, it's me," but
The suspense builds, right? They go
it
through
goes
the
all the way through.
tribes, the clans, the family, etc.
That's right. That's right. So it's extensive, and the punishment that's inflicted on Achan is virtually the destroy of him and his legacy. And uh, it mentions that his property, his sons, his daughters, and as I mentioned in the paper, but not his wife. His wife's not mentioned. So
Mm.
if he's married, she's included, but she's not mentioned, which I think is interesting in light of Ananias and Sapphira, because the wife
Tied
is
together, yeah.
is not only mentioned, she gets to stand for herself, which I think is significant. And so,
Right.
So
and
this
Yeah.
word nos fixo, which is to misappropriate, keep back.
yeah,
Mm.
Tell us a
yeah,
little bit about it. It only occurs
Right.
in Acts and Joshua in the New and Old Testament. It does appear in one instance, I think, in Second Maccabees. But
yeah.
outside of that, it's not a regular word that you run across very often.
No, it's not. In fact, it's fairly precise that it involves deception, that it is a deceptive misappropriation of funds would probably be pretty good interpretation of what the term means. And it's probably the major key that ties these two stories together because of the rare occurrence of it. I believe the in the New Testament it also occurs in Titus, if I remember right. There's one other occurrence I
Mm.
think in the New Testament, but
Interesting.
it doesn't seem to be an echo to this. But so what makes this an echo is the context of the stories of misappropriating funds and deception and punishment.
And we have on our
So
screen for those watching on YouTube, we've thrown up, a list of the parallels between these two stories that I
right.
think will help you in understanding the intertextuality that occurs between each of them. Uh, so, Greg, I think
Yeah.
you're asking about this concept of cherem that Stan mentioned. I think
Right.
the audience, or at least I need more elucidation.
Yeah. This Achan is stoned for this. This is
That's right.
obviously very serious, and in the
Yeah.
same way, Ananias and Sapphira dropped dead.
Yeah.
Um, so why is this so serious? What's
Yeah.
happening in devoted things that makes this such a serious
Yeah.
crime?
Yeah. I think we've got some English translations that basically makes devoted things, the band, stuff that needs to be destroyed, but that's not the basic meaning. The basic meaning is that it's so fully given to God that it's not for human use. And so in that case, one of the ways it is destroyed to make sure that it's not used by humans, or so it's in one way it's very symbolic stuff. It's very symbolic in because you, obviously destroying the material doesn't make it very useful at all, but that is the basic thought. And Park does this study in which he's the most recent researcher to take a look at this text. And he he thinks that the Acts story is a case of carom or anathema. Um, I actually mentioned in mine that for the intertextual connection, you don't really need to play that out. But the more
Yeah.
I've thought about it, if there is a New Testament example of this concept, this certainly gets us as close as any other story.
Right, right.
Yeah,
Hmm.
Now, in the Achan story, the things that are under the ban are dictated by God. These are under the ban.
yeah,
Don't do this.
mhm.
But Peter makes it clear to Ananias and Sapphira that while it remained unsold, it was yours. You could do with it
That's right.
as you want. So how does harem get applied when they had a choice here At what point does it become the equivalent of something that is anathema or karen?
No, in my thinking, it comes at the time that they say we're giving all. And I suspect that's how they said it. They didn't say a price. We're giving all of the proceeds to the use of God, the community. And so that when Peter comes and questions him, did you sell it for such and such? And he says, oh, yeah. So Peter actually knows the actual selling price, and so again, Luke doesn't tell you exactly how all that happened, but
Right.
but I think once it becomes dedicated to God, you can't take it back.
Yeah.
And they're the ones who dedicated it.
Yes, and voluntarily and of free will. But I think it happens at this point for the same reason we get it at the early part of Joshua, is that if this is allowed to go by, it's precedent setting.
Yeah.
It's that you can trick or cheat God, and you can defraud the community of blessings that might come to them. And of course, the blessings that came to the ancient Israelite community is victory in battle, which did not happen next because of this.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if something like that is in the thinking of Luke, is that this is kind of the beginning of this new community. And so this one is dealt with ever so harshly because it is the president.
Early on in the narrative. That's interesting.
Now, obviously, there's been lots of people who've probably cheated in this kind of thing over the years, and we don't necessarily see them dropping dead. So
Are there other connections between these stories beyond the use of this word that occurs to describe what they did in both instances? I think there's some other parallels, right, Stan?
Well, I think there's some really good ones. Some that I noted included things like, well, the inappropriate possession of property. We've touched on that. Astonishment at the outrageousness of the sin happens in both texts. Deception and lying happens in both texts. I would argue that the way in which the sinner is confronted and brought out, while somewhat different, one by lots and another by confrontation, kind of essentially the same dynamic. I would argue that Joshua as God's representative and Peter as God's representative speaks for God authoritatively. Both characters are mentioned as having renown or famous, except in the case of Acts, it's the apostles in general. But Peter is pointed out along the way. We've already talked about the fear.
Mm-hmm.
I pointed out there are people who died in the battle of Ai. So there were more deaths than just Achan and his people.
36, I think, right?
And so I suggest there might be a sense of a double death in the Achan story or in the Ananias and Sapphira story, because you end up with two deaths. So I would also say, no, that's kind of grabbed most of them. I think some of the work that I do on the echoing back and forth of what's being said in each case is very similar to each other. So,
and in both cases, the groups go on to a lot of success. So after they deal
move
with,
forward. They move forward. Yeah.
Yep. And it's a community-wide consequence as well, right? You have the community that expands afterwards, but
that's right.
I think in your article you talk about community-wide consequences. Maybe elaborate on that a bit.
Yeah. There's a sense in which the Old Testament views, I'm reaching for language even in the article, but if this is not dealt with, it becomes something of a contaminant or something of, one might even say, a virus. And so I'm wondering if the same conception could be said. The same thing is that if the Achan or the Ananias and Sapphira stories not dealt with, what is the impact on the community at large? That it's not just an individual sin that doesn't have ramifications to the larger community. In each case, I would say it does possibly have ramifications to the larger community, at least from Luke's point of view.
Yeah, that anticipates my question. We're not talking that they murdered somebody and had to be dealt with. This is,
Yeah,
in some ways, it's a real estate transaction. They sell some property and they don't quite give as much as they say they gave.
yeah.
What makes this a dangerous virus, to use that image that you just did?
I think in both cases that covenant calls for total devotion. And so these become symbolic cases and stories of which this is when when people are not wholly devoted to God, they're holding back some for themselves. They're holding themselves back. I don't want to go narcissistic on this at all, but it's kind of the notion that uh, it's not God said do something and then He punishes you because you didn't do it. It's a much larger conception that we belong to a covenant people that have a particular way of living. And Luke has already laid out that the way we live is that when somebody's in need, we will sell what we have in order to make sure others are in need. And the interesting thing, I think, for the Luke story is that if it is an example of Karam or the band, the beneficiary here are the people of God. This money is going to be, and maybe that's the infection part, is this money is going to be used for the good of largely the poor.
Yeah.
So,
It certainly happens, in chapter 6, where you have the
yeah,
Right.
distribution
yeah,
happening, where maybe, this initial kind of ad hoc approach of benefaction wasn't working, so they needed something more formal, which is what you get in chapter 6, right?
yeah. Well, they do have to structure it. It becomes a bit more complicated. So, but
Yep.
I also think that we modern folks, we find ourselves frustrated at God for doing divine punishment. And I'm not sure Luke would share our surprise. I'm not sure anybody in you know the article was basically to touch on. Originally, my article was designed to say that the God you meet in the Old Testament, at least in this particular story of Achan, is also the very
It's
much
all
the
the
same,
same.
very much the same God you meet in Acts chapter 5.
Well, and in your article, Stan, you point out that this isn't the only instance where there's divine violence that occurs to
Right.
Oh,
individuals or punishment. There's a number of other instances. Call some of those out for our audience. I think they'll find those
Oh,
helpful.
well, of course, I think the one that might be a close second, if there's an echo, is Nadab and Abihu, who offer strange fire, foreign fire, whatever that means.
Hmm.
And the comparison there is not only are they struck dead, but is it their cousins or their nephews are the ones who take the body out? And so you've actually got a similar story to
Young men.
young men coming to take the body, but you can virtually say anytime where fatality is the outcome, you've got a possible echo. And I do touch on in the article other stories. I just didn't think any of them actually contended. But with intertextuality, he may be working. Luke may be working as his prototype with the Achan story, but there's no reason he can't pull from those other stories as well.
They're in the
So
back of his mind, if not the back of the reader's mind. And as we talked with
that's
Scott
right.
on the Ethiopian eunuch,
Mhm. Mhm.
the article he wrote on the connection
Uh,
with the Song of Songs, it doesn't necessarily need to be an intentional intertextual allusion for it to elucidate the text at the same time.
yeah, there's
You can have some of the same dynamics going on as with
that's right.
Elisha's servant who goes goes and gets the money that was being offered
That's
when
right.
Elisha told him not to, and he suffered
Yeah,
consequences. So
yeah.
it's more
Is that
broadly connecting.
is that in Luke's background? Possibly. I mean, Luke, as we could tell,
Was
as
back in Luke chapter 4, right? So,
that's right. There is no doubt that Luke knows the Septuagint quite well. He knows the Greek translation of the Old Testament text. There is the case of Jeroboam's son found in First Kings. I don't think that one applies because we don't have any editions of the Septuagint that transmit that story.
hmm.
So Does he know it?
Interesting.
Possibly. I don't have any way to do it. And the Susanna story of being where she's falsely accused by the elders has this sense of people being called out by Daniel, and the outcome is death.
Hmm.
So there's several stories that could possibly have fueled this story or funded this story. But I feel pretty safe saying you've got most of it with Ananias or with Achan,
Right.
most of it. So,
Yeah.
but I wouldn't rule out the possibility that Luke has an echo here and there.
Right.
So,
Well, and as with music, you don't always have to exactly copy a riff to
that's
make it
right.
sound very similar. So, to
Yeah,
use a music
yeah,
metaphor. Yeah.
yeah, that's right.
So, what's the effect of this event? It comes at a very critical moment, much like with Achan. Are we needing to set some boundaries here in the early church? You've got
Yeah,
the possibility of, as you say, this
yeah.
virus going out of control. Do we need to kind of draw some hard lines?
I think the hard line that I would draw for Luke is that Luke wants to give us a very idyllic picture of the early church, and he's willing to tell us there's warts, but he's also willing to tell us of their course corrections.
Hmm.
So, um, in there's certain things that happen in the early part of the book that you don't hear about as much in the later part of. For example, coming out of a restorationist tradition like I grew up in, these were intended to be almost templates for how we do church, but we didn't quite know how to handle all these stories, and so you get this picture of devoted to the apostles' teaching, breaking bread together, meeting every day, and you get another hint of that in chapter 4. But once you begin to move into the less Jewish regions, you don't hear that language much anymore. And by the time you get into the latter part of the book of Acts, that's not how you identify the Christian community necessarily. Although I think Luke is assuming something of that continues, some of that great community continues and cares for one another. In fact, when Paul is addressed by the apostles one time, um, they said, "Make sure you remember the poor."
Yeah.
And so that part of it is deeply embedded, but you see hints, but not, again, you just don't see that kind of description of Christian community, say after chapter 10.
Yeah. But you certainly have it, in Paul's collection for
Mm-hmm.
the
Hmm.
Christians in Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
And then, like even the end with chapter 27, Julius the centurion shows a lot of kindness and almost benefaction to Paul. And then you have the barbarians on Malta who are expected to do the exact opposite
Yeah,
based on, the ethnic um,
yeah,
understanding that existed back in antiquity. When you've heard the word,
uh,
barbarians are the guys from Malta, you thought, well, these are very inhospitable people, where as they did the exact opposite when Paul visits
yeah,
them. So I think you do have it carried forward. Tom
yeah.
Phillips, who we interviewed
Hmm.
for a podcast a while back,
That's right.
podcast, argues that it does change a little bit, but it does carry on through the end
Yeah,
of
yeah,
Acts.
yeah, yeah. I would still say, in fact, I've argued that Acts really is about the hospitality of God, and that the stories of conversion that we have are not stories of conversion per se. In fact, they're very particular stories chosen by Luke. And I think you can make a stronger case that they're acts of inclusion.
Yeah.
I'm sure that came out with the Ethiopian eunuch. I haven't had a chance to see that particular podcast, but
Yeah, absolutely. You're spot
uh,
on. And then Joel's book on conversions in Acts,
that's right.
great
I
book. Joel
I've got
Crane.
a sermon that I preach from time to time that um, I've named after Sidney Poitier, the movie Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. And I don't know if you remember that particular movie, but the storyline was a white lady in love with an African American and introducing the family for the first time. That's kind of where the comedies of the show. But what I point out is that as you go through the book of Acts, the next character that's converted or introduced or baptized is basically someone the previous group would have had a hard time welcoming.
Yep.
And you can almost do that all the way through the book, saying, we start off with these Jewish folks with their purity codes, and by the time you get down to I usually use Lydia, because Luke is actually trying to say something with Lydia, and then get a couple of chuckles about including the Baptists in the fellowship, the folks in Acts chapter 19 that are devoted to. But the book of Acts has this way of going through and saying, and the critical stories in which the Holy Spirit shows up.
Mhm.
The purpose of that is so that if the Holy Spirit comes upon these people, you've got to accept them.
It's a
And
validation.
that's why you
Yeah.
only get 4 examples of that. The Jews themselves who've been accepted, right? The Samaritans, Cornelius, and then those Baptist guys back in Acts 19.
Yep. That's a great point. Well, before
Yeah.
we got to talk about the gender issue here. We can't leave Sapphira out of the
Yeah.
equation. Before we do that, violence. We've talked a lot about it already, but violence is not foreign to Acts. You have certainly the
No.
divine enacting violence, not only here but in a few other places. I'll let you
Uh-huh.
talk about those. But you also have the opponents who frequently enact violence upon
That's right.
Jesus on the early followers in Acts.
Yeah, I just recently had a chance to teach First and Second Corinthians, and that First Corinthians is co-authored by Sosthenes. And when you read of the founding of the church in the book of Acts, Acts 18, he takes a pretty good beating.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
So I think our audience should check those out. I mean, from a divine standpoint, you have John the Baptist warnings, you have the barren fig tree, the parable of
yeah.
13, you have the Son of Man stuff in Luke 17, destruction of Jerusalem, and Jesus weeping shortly after,
Yeah.
he prophesies the destruction of Jerusalem. You have, as we talked a bit about in the Rhoda episode we did, you have Herod. Which the same word is used to describe what happens with Peter being nudged in the side. It's more than a nudge, and Peter or Herod actually dying there. So the
Yeah.
divine certainly it's not only here where you see that happen, but you have it happen elsewhere. So all right, we got to talk about the gender issue and the fact, which is kind of interesting because you have just Achan, wife isn't mentioned, but Anna, Sapphira here, it's almost a parallel. The same thing that happens narratively to Ananias basically happens to Sapphira here, I think, right, Greg?
Right. I mean, they come in, they say how much, boom, dead. And the poor guys who have to carry them out, they cut back in, and here's another dead body. Not a good day for them happening.
Not a good day.
Is this a gender issue? Is this a marital issue? Is it saying something about the tightness of their relationship with each other that overcomes the relationship that they should be having with the church? Why this double story with a husband and wife? Not just a man and a woman, but a husband and a wife.
Yeah, I would say a couple of things. One is that it kind of matches Luke's interest in folks being baptized, both men and women. It too is an example of double stories, like the 2 prophets that pronounce at the beginning of Gospel of Luke, and when you get to Acts, is it Acts 9 or so, where you've got Aeneas, Hild, and Dorcas. And so I think you've got some of that. So that's just part of it. But I also think that for Luke, it is because Luke's dealing with inclusion in the Jewish community, in which there was a very specific sign that only men could do. And I think one of the radical new beginnings that happens with Pentecost is the full recognition that both men and women are welcomed into community. What I find fascinating about this story is that I think it gets to the heart of what the Bible would say is the basic view of men and women. They are fully themselves. They can fully speak for themselves. They can represent themselves. And so I think that's implicit in this story. I think Willie Jennings, in his commentary, very popular commentary on Acts, I think he's wrong. He's wanting to say that this is the demise of the sovereignty of the couple. I don't think there's anything in Acts that would actually go. In fact, uh, our teaching couple, Priscilla and Aquila, is that the reassertion of the couple? I don't think, it's not even Luke's conversation.
Yeah.
But I do find it fascinating that this woman is, if she wanted to change her mind, if she wanted to say, you're right, I conspired, I was wrong, I think you might have gotten a different outcome.
Yeah.
But she had a chance to do that, and nobody in Achan's family even had a shot at that. It was going to go down regardless, So, and like I've mentioned, Achan's wife isn't even mentioned in the story.
Hmm.
So I don't know if you guys
Sapphira does choose to repeat the lie of her husband, so they
She
have
does.
conspired together. So,
Yes, they have. Yeah,
Yeah.
they've made the same decision. So, but
That was not a foregone conclusion in the minds of the reader or the listeners of this text, right? Because
I
they
don't
didn't
think
know
I
the
don't, I don't
conclusion
think
like we do. They're anticipating what's going to happen. The 3 hour lapse and in comes Sapphira. What's going to happen to her is what they're wondering in their minds, not, she's going to get zapped just like Ananias. They don't know that. They haven't read the
that's right. The first time you hear the story, that would be the
right.
case. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I do think though that there's a hint um, of when you hear Paul when he's not trying to solve a problem, Paul will say some radical things like a husband has authority over his wife, but a wife also has authority over her husband. Nobody in the ancient world saying that kind of stuff. Even in the place where he talks about the head covering, he'll talk about how men and women are, certainly woman comes from man in the creation story, and then man comes from woman. But he'll actually come back and say, oh, by the way, we're interdependent of each other. You're not going to be here without a woman, right? And a woman's not going to be complete in some ways without a man. It's interesting that Paul has so any conversations I think around gender that goes in terms of either egalitarian or hierarchy misses the fuller dimension. I would just say relationships are about reciprocity, and so I try to illustrate it with my hands rolling over each other. Yeah,
That's absolutely the case in Luke Acts.
so
You have me
yeah,
convinced.
yeah,
Right.
yeah. I don't know what more to make of that other than the fascinating fact that she stands for herself. She speaks for herself.
So we have these, Greg, I think, mentioned it, these young men who come in and carry the body out. And then they come in and carry the second body out. They're getting a workout that day. Put on your youth minister hat. Is there something to say about young people in this? And does Luke Acts have anything to say? Because this isn't the only, have the, the young men again. I think it's back, in chapter 21, Paul's young relative that, serves as the intermediary there. You have, Philip's daughters and so forth. Is there anything that you think the text might be saying in terms of young men, young
I
women
think
here?
I think there's certainly awareness that this life together has a generational quality to it. And so I'm kind of thinking of these young men as old men retelling this story. What would that have looked like?
Wow. Yeah.
I was there. I saw it. Um, yeah, I don't see Luke saying anything overtly. I think we're getting the fact of the matter is that some of the younger men came. I'm wondering if he's possibly setting us up a little bit for the various services that might uh, be taken over in Acts chapter 6 by the young men or by the guys who end up taking care of the Hellenistic widows.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Hmm.
and it certainly sounds like you could have a community in which each level's doing their, older men are not the one coming in, younger men because they need to be strong. I don't know all of that. I don't see Luke making a terribly big point here, but maybe one would be able to step back and, you make me think of Mark and the young man who escaped at night is apparently the same young man that's on the rock at the resurrection.
Yeah.
But that's another story altogether. I know Matthew says Matthew says two angels, but Mark says young men.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, Stan, if you're in the church, which you are a lot, and
A lot.
you're going to do a study on this, and you're going to move between different groups, youth groups, women's groups, men's groups, the church as a whole. What do you want people to experience in those various kinds of settings about this text? Because it certainly sounds different, I think, when you're working with different groups.
Yeah, it does. I think the commonality that that I would probably work with all of these groups and this particular text. By the way, recently this Sunday I was preaching at a Lutheran church, and they do Stewardship Month in November, and of course here I am a guest. How do you speak to this? And so I would certainly preach what's inside your heart is more important than what you give. Turning it to kind of a homiletic approach is what ultimately happened here was not about money. It was about the effect on the community. It was about what was going on within Ananias and Sapphira that would lead them to think. And also, we've not put you're lying to the Holy Spirit. That sounds like a pretty serious thing. Particularly for a church community that supposedly takes the nature of God and the reverence of God very seriously. Yeah. So I think there's several things that I would preach there. I tend to preach, if the congregation's small enough, I like to do rhetorical questions. So I will ask the congregation, what is it that you hear in this story?
Yeah.
And kind of get a little bit of feedback, to actually hear how they're processing this particular story. So,
well, it's good to hear that you wouldn't pass the hat and say, "Don't hold back."
You know what? I hadn't put that in my toolkit yet, but thank you for that suggestion.
Or else.
That would be
Or else.
precisely the text. But you know
Don't
what
be
happens,
lying to me.
Guys, once we set this text in kind of its textual framework, it's really not as shocking as it was at first.
Yeah.
It's, in some sense, if Luke is in fact telling the continuing story of the work of God, that's precisely what he's doing, the continuing work of the. And how do we recognize it as such? Because we've heard this story before. Yeah.
Very true. So, if we think about the text, a few takeaways, it seems that, at least for me, this concept of the community and kinship and the fact that you can't violate the sacred bond you have as a member of the ἐκκλησία, to bring it back to, the conclusion of the episode. That's one of the key takeaways for me. Any other thoughts stand beyond that one? Or do you want to add to what I just said?
Paul's got that interesting saying, talking as a believer among believers. Paul's got that interesting text that suggests that the way the Corinthians were participating in communion, that in fact some of them had fallen asleep, had died. If we really believe that there is a sovereign God, then God can do this thing pretty much any way he wants to. And I love, whether you're Calvinistic or Arminian, we have a tendency of defining how God has to do things. I think that's one of the antidotes this text says. At least if you're taking Luke's view seriously, God can do this thing any way he wants to. And God is sovereign.
You wouldn't take this as a blueprint for the church.
No. In fact,
confronting, banning.
In fact, I would reject any notion that the New Testament functions as a manual, simply because there's very little of it. The closest thing you get to a manual is what? 1 Timothy and Titus.
That's what I was about to say.
It's not a manual. And so I spend a lot of energy, and I'll preach a sermon here in a couple of weeks that's basically, here's a 2-step process for us to use when reading scripture: is try to listen to it in its first voice and then ask, what is this text telling me? Instead of saying, the Bible tells me to blank.
Yeah.
Well, most of the time that won't get you in trouble. Sometimes it will get you into serious trouble.
Well, we come from traditions, both you and I and Patrick, that often have treated it that way.
Yeah.
These are models for us to follow. And what you seem to be saying is that this is much more broad about the nature of the community and God's work with the community and how serious to take that.
We miss the richness of the text, I think, right? These stories don't come to life if you're trying to read it as a manual and a checklist.
Yeah. And they tell us something about a Christian perspective on God, which has in modern times leaned, although it's kind of leaning back to the harshness of God, but almost too harsh in some circles, and usually the harshness of God comes with the caveat, oh, by the way, I represent that way. And so if you don't agree with me, then you must be wrong. And so this requires a little more humility than that we kind of, was it Bart who said, I don't stand on the word of God, I stand under it. And so that's one perspective for believers to take is this instructs us into the story of God. I do think it's fair to say, in what ways do our own lives and stories echo these stories? Because we do believe that the biblical story provides us with something of a script that gives us a template for kind of looking at our whole story. How does God, I will sometimes give my rendition of the mission of God as God's mission has always been to form distinct communities to live his life for the sake of the world. And I say any text you read is simply can be reduced to that. I don't want to over reduce it, but so I would ask a Bible study group in this is, what do you think the mission of God is in this text? And then I would ask, if that is the mission of God, what do you need to adjust in your life to find yourself in sync with God's mission? I still think you can do it with this text, as harsh as it is.
Yeah. Very true. Very true. Well,
especially if you're linking it out.
Good, great.
I was going to say, if you're linking it out to the Achan story and showing that longer dynamic and how it fits with the passages, not only intertextually like that, but how it's in the sequence within Acts. And not just focusing solely on this passage alone.
That's right. Yeah. I would also, go ahead.
No.
I was going to say this text is good antidote for us not to see the Old Testament as one world, the New Testament as another world, but actually to see, and I really think Luke is seeing this, is that God is keeping his promises as he's always said. That's Luke's perspective. Right. And that we are dealing here with the people of God. Yeah, very good. Hey, thanks, guys. This was fun.
What else? I think we'll have you back again.
Yes.
Oh,
do a third time. How's that? Let to figure out when. This has been a lively conversation. We appreciate your time.
All right.
For our audience, thanks for listening to another Scriptural Works podcast. You can find other Scriptural Works podcasts on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, or our website at scripturalworks.com. We look forward to having you listen to our next podcast. Thanks, Dan.
So good to be with you guys.
For other podcast episodes of Scriptural Works featuring co-hosts Greg Camp and Patrick Spencer, as well as a variety of different special guests, visit us at scripturalworks.com, YouTube, Apple Podcast, or Spotify. And don't forget to check out the growing repository of podcast companion articles found at scripturalworks.com. And finally, if you find our podcast episodes thought-provoking and helpful, make sure to share them on your social channels.